Okay, well, sometimes you run across historical markers that are not quite correct on what they say, and that presents a problem. And I tried to research the history of this one we're going to talk about today. I want to talk about Fort Mason, a Seminole War fort in Central Florida. First off, this shirt's another shirt I made kind of on Rick Obermeyer's pattern of Seminole shirts circa about 1900. There, I kind of made it in honor of Rick Obermeyer when he passed away. So, um, so let's have a look at here and let's do. Okay, Fort Mason in Central Florida near the town of Eustis in Lake County. And uh, we're trying to figure out the time period. Unfortunately, there are no post returns, so that tells me it's a Florida militia fort. This is a map of the seat of war of Florida in 1836. This is General Scott's map. In fact, there's an original on the wall in the Dade battlefield. So you look in the area, and Fort Mason is not on here. There's Uchee Billy's camp down there. It should be around here. And also notice that Fort Mellon is not there. There's Volusia up at Spring Garden. So let's look on this Jessup map. Thomas Jessup, he ordered all the soldiers to put their notes on the map and make up a map from the officers in the field. So let's look up on that. And of course, there's Lake Eustis, and I guess that's Lake Yale. You can see General Jessup's path. There's also no Fort Mason. There's the road that goes from Volusia, Fort Call, which there's a historical marker for. Seeing the road come down to Dade Battlefield or Fort Armstrong. So that's there, but there's no Fort Mason at that time. Now on the Blake McKay map in 1839, which tries to be the most comprehensive map, it finally shows up on here. So let's look up. Here's Volusia again at the crossing on the St. Johns River. The road comes down, and there's Fort Mason right there on the roadway. General Eustis's trail, it said. And of course, that goes to Palakakaha and Fort Armstrong. And where Fort Mason is, it has another road that swings down, goes to Fort Mellon here from that. So we knew the fort was in place by the time this map was made. So 1838, 1839, the map was from 1839. So here's a more detailed map. This map is, of course, later in the war or later at time because there's so much detail, a surveyor's map. And you come down the trail here, this somewhat where Highway 19 is, Lake Yale, and there's Fort Mason right on there between two ponds, and that of course must be the road that goes to Fort Mellon. I guess this map might date to the 1840s when they're really trying to survey. Of course, here's a close-up of it. Fort Mason between these two ponds. And of course, there's a historical marker today. It says during the Second Seminole War, troops under the command of Brigadier General Abraham Eustis left Volusia County. Actually, they left the settlement of Volusia. Not sure if Volusia County had been formed yet. Headed towards the Withlacoochee River as part of a military action in the response of the December 28, 1835 massacre. Major Francis stayed in his command near Bushnell. In March 1836, the troops camped nearby while a bridge was constructed over the Ocklawaha River to the west. They built a fortified stockade 1 mile south of this location on the east side of Smith Lake. It was named Fort Mason most likely in honor of Colonel Pierce Mason Butler, who led the expedition and after whom was named Fort Butler near Astor. Astor is the Lake County side of Volusia and was also named after hostility ended. Fort Mason became a supply base and support and encouraged settlement in the area, which would later become Lake County. With the coming of the railroad in the 1880s, the town on the north shore of Lake Eustis took its name from Fort Mason. So going back here, Fort Mason was not exactly on the shore of Lake Eustis, but I guess they borrowed the name because there's a name familiar with them nearby. And of course, the historical marker along Highway 19 today. And looking on the, the website, let's go to the website here for the historical marker database. Here it is, historical marker database, one of my favorite websites for looking up historical markers. And it has about here and, just the pictures I showed you along Highway 19. And let's look on the map here. Okay, here's the marker here near Lake Yale, and Lake Eustis is, of course, south of Lake Yale. And of course, that's where the marker is. Now, looking at the other map, kind of, as much as we can figure out, the two ponds have kind of changed shape. So it was somewhere around here where the fort was. So the marker is only about a mile away. No, not too bad for historical markers. Sometimes I just know it most appropriate, the restaurant nearby, the Mason jar. So that's appropriate for a restaurant to be there. Maybe I could check it out. I'm supposed to do a road trip down there recently. So that's where it is on the map in Lake County. Actually, couple weeks I'll be over Lake Norris for our Camp Lenoche camp staff reunion in Seminole Springs. That's a private springs too. That's a pretty springs, but you'll get chased out, as we found out when I worked on camp staff there. So, okay, let's go back. So, Fort Mason, it said it was named after this guy, Colonel Pierce Mason Butler. It's kind of unusual to have a fort named after his middle name, and he already has a fort, Fort Butler, named after him, which is Astor or the Lake County side of Volusia. This is a portrait of him. He was commissioned an officer in 1819, age uh, 21, and he spent a lot. He was in, I think he was in the second infantry or something, but he got transferred to the first, seventh infantry, had most of his career in the seventh infantry, and was in the regular army for 10 years until he resigned. This uniform is from the 1820s. They had these big shoulder boards, and you don't see too many of the 1820s uniforms, which I think is kind of neat. And so he became a planter and a plantation owner in South Carolina, got involved in politics, and he was not a Jackson man. In fact, he backed the Bank of the United States, and he was in favor of nullification, was on the one of the delegates for the nullification. So he was definitely on the opposite side of the fence of Andrew Jackson. And when the Second Seminole War happened and General Abraham Eustis, who was in Charleston, he gets some of the South Carolina militia. And of course, Butler here became colonel of the regiment, Colonel Pierce M. Butler, and he went to Florida with Eustis, saw several actions in Florida around Spring Garden and Tomoka. Another account I read says he spent most of his time down in Fort Brooke, in charge of the ordinance, issuing the ordinance. So anyway, and then that was in 1836, and he got back to South Carolina, where in December 1836 he was voted as governor of South Carolina, voted by the legislature, which is how they did that back then. And so he was governor for about 2 or 3 years, and is still very prominent politician and official in South Carolina. When the Mexican War happened, he formed up the South Carolina militia again and went down to Mexico, and he was killed in the Battle of Churubusco in 1847, age 49. So that's Pierce Butler, who they claim was named after Fort Mason was named after him, but I kind of doubt it. There's another Mason. And actually, before I get to that, there's two books I found reference of Pierce Butler, Colonel Butler. Here is one. There's one reference in here of him with Eustis's campaign, and that's by the Seminole War Foundation, Debbie Harper. This was kind of one of the last books Frank Lummer was working on before he passed away. So we're glad to get the account published. It's an account by W. W. Smith. And then there's M. M. Cohen, another account published in 1836, notices of the campaign in Florida. He mentions Colonel Butler several times and some of the actions he saw in Florida. So there's a couple pages on, but there's almost nothing left of no reference of Fort Mason. Now here's the other Mason, Colonel James or Captain James B. Mason, who was the first Florida militia from Jacksonville. He was under the command of Colonel John Warren. He rose through the ranks. Yeah, I think he originally enlisted as like a sergeant. He was became a lieutenant, and then he's a captain here. This is paperwork for a captain. Uh, and then he was killed in the Florida War. And the Army Navy Chronicle has information on that. This is volume 11, page 13 and 14, report by Colonel Bennett Riley of the 2nd Infantry, talked about Colonel Mason's company of mounted volunteers with the 2nd Infantry, amounting to 261 men. They're scouting the Withlacoochee area. They passed by Panisofsky on the morning of the 31st of May. The advance guard under the command of Captain Mason came upon an Indian warrior, succeeded in taking him prisoner. Interrogating him, I learned that there were but two small parties of Indians in the vicinity of the Withlacoochee that they are cultivating in the Wahoo, and by this guidance, I succeeded in reaching one of them within a couple hours after capturing a prisoner, where he said he had left 5 warriors with his wife and children. On my arrival, I found the Indians discovered our approach and made their escape in the boggy swamps of the Wahoo. Okay, scouting in this vicinity continues upon that. They're in the Wahoo. The Indian prisoners stayed the second party were cultivating, and they returned I'm not going to read the whole thing, just detailing destruction of the fields they find cultivating. On the 2nd of June, I moved the command to the old fort on the Withlacoochee, about 20 miles below Fort Dade. So that's, I guess, near the where the Battle of Wahoo Swamp was, where I parted from the wagons, left a guard of 50 men for their protection under the command of Lieutenant Powell, and proceeded to Chocochatty, Savannah, where I surprised an Indian camp, killing 3 warriors and took 3 warriors prisoner. It is a source of much regret that I have to report that one squaw among those was killed. She was taken for a warrior, but one of the volunteers in the advance fired upon as she was endeavoring to make her escape. Just before 1 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd, in spite of every precaution that had been taken to secure him, the Indian prisoner was near the Panisovki, effected his escape from the body of the guard, and was fired upon by the sentinel placed over him. The sentinel had fallen asleep, and when the warrior started to escape, then it woke up the sentinel. But it says that in the letter, but not here in the Army Navy Chronicle. So he starts firing, which caused the commotion in the camp, which several guns were fired along the line of the hammock near where the command was encamped. And fortunately, the night being dark, Captain Mason of the Volunteers, who had shown himself a zealous and active officer, received a wound from a Jaeger ball, which caused his death in a few minutes. So the warrior escapes, so the guards start shooting, and that causes a general panic and melee in the camp as everybody starts shooting everywhere. And unfortunately, Captain Mason was shot through the heart and killed. He was a very well-respected officer, from the records that I saw, who met a sad ending. And also on Ancestry, it has his uh, uh, will and probate records, which is kind of cool. So anyway, that's Captain James Mason. And since there's no post returns from Fort Mason, I'm kind of thinking that Fort Mason is named after Captain James Mason of the Florida militia. When there's no post returns, it means that the militia is using the fort and not the regulars. There's also a couple cemeteries on Find a Grave, the Fort Mason Cemetery and Old Fort Mason Cemetery. They are post Civil War. All the people buried in there are from after the Civil War. In fact, both of them are pretty much the same family too, the Dykes family. Um, so that's uh, that's a remnant of, although it's called Fort Mason, the cemeteries really don't have any connection to it. So that's interesting. We don't have much anything else on Fort Mason. I couldn't find anything in the adjutant records, no post returns, no other mention on that. So that's why I feel that's um, a Florida militia post, and probably named after Captain Mason, not Colonel Butler. So anyway, that is my short video on Fort Mason. That was more about the two different officers, which you probably didn't hear about from anyone else either. Not well known. Colonel Butler's more known for his Mexican War, and also Colonel Butler is also famous in Indian territory out west. I need to talk about that. When he was with the 7th Infantry, he was at Fort Gibson and Fort Smith, Arkansas. And then, of course, after he was governor, he went out west again and he was Indian agent to the Cherokee. So, so he has actually more information you can probably get of him out west than you can in the east. So, anyway, that's enough for now. Thank you for stopping by.